Columbus in Portugal. On August 13, 1476, the Genoese merchant ship that Columbus was traveling on was attacked by French privateers and sunk. Leaping from the sinking vessel into the sea, Columbus managed to catch hold of a piece of wood from the wreckage and amazingly reached shore safely. The ship on which he had been sailing was one of a merchant fleet of 5 bound for the Netherlands. 4 of the ships belonged to merchant bankers of Genoa. The 5th came from the Netherlands and flew the flag of Burgundy, which caused the disaster. As the fleet rounded the tip of Portugal, the flag was sighted by the commander of a French war fleet. Since his king, Louis XI, was at war with Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, the French commander immediately gave order to fire, and the battle began. 3 ships from Genoa went down. The other 2, badly battered and burned, struggled into the nearest port for repairs. This happened to be the harbor of Lagos, made famous by Prince Henry the Navigator. So it was here, by chance, that Columbus was washed ashore in Portugal, at the very spot where the work had been done that made his future voyage of discovery possible. It took Columbus many days to recover from his wounds, but as soon as he was able, he made his way to Lisbon to find his brother Bartholomew. Some years earlier, when work was scarce in Genoa, Bartholomew, who had become a map-maker, had sought employment in Lisbon. Columbus had found Lisbon what Genoa had once been, a bustling harbor with ships and seamen out of ports all the way from Norway to Africa. Bartholomew, his brother, was doing well in his chart and map-making shop, being industrious and very skillful in his art. He would have been more than glad to have Christopher join him in the business, but the less practical older brother was not ready for that. He still dreamed of visiting far parts of the world that he had never seen. Shortly after the new year, his chance came. Columbus heard that a trading ship was leaving Lisbon and headed for Iceland, which was then called the island of Thule. He immediately signed up for the voyage. On the way, the ship stopped at Galway in Ireland, and it may have reached the shore of Greenland, for he wrote later, "I sailed in the year 1477, in the month of February, 100 leagues beyond the island of Thule. To this island, which is as big as England, come the English with their merchandise." Columbus was back in Lisbon by spring, sure of what he wanted to do and what he needed to learn. So far he had learned little, if anything, from books, only from experience. Now he intended to read all that had ever been written about navigation, exploration, and geography, even though to do so he had first to learn Latin as well as Castilian and Portuguese. He must learn, and this was the place to learn, here in Portugal, which led the world in exploration and discovery. Some day a Portuguese captain would return to Lisbon with the great news that he had rounded the end of Africa and found a passage to India. So far no one had succeeded. Columbus himself perhaps could not say exactly when, after he began to read and study, the idea came to him that it might be easier to reach India by sailing west. It had, however, occurred to Portugal's King Alfonso. There was a physician in Florence, Italy, by the name of Toscanelli, who was also a mathematician and an astronomer. The king had written to him asking about a new route to India. In reply there came a letter from Toscanelli dated June 25, 1474, in which he wrote that he was delighted to hear that the king was interested in a shorter way of going by sea to the lands of spices. He enclosed a chart of the course for a ship sailing westward from Portugal, which, he said, would bring it to China, empire of the Great Khan. Another course would pass the noble island of Simpangu, or Japan. most fertile in pearls and precious stones, where they cover the temples and palaces in solid gold. Nothing, however, was done with this information. Alfonso V, who had never shared his famous Uncle Henry's zest for exploration, and was far more excited by battles and victories, such as he had won in North Africa, had let it drop. At present, he was about to engage in a fascinating war with Castile, whereby he fully expected to become its king, ousting that impudent girl Isabella, who had snubbed his proposal of marriage, and now, upon the death of her brother, had become queen. Alfonso had received a letter from the Archbishop of Toledo, who for years had been Isabella's most loyal supporter. Now the Archbishop had turned against the young queen and hatched a plot with the supporters of Juana. According to the letter, which Alfonso read with enthusiasm, he was to marry his niece Juana, invade Castile with an army, and make good her claim to the crown. All the nobles of Castile, the Archbishop assured him, would rally to his cause. The victory would be won easily. Juana would be declared queen, and he, Alfonso, would be king of Castile. Alfonso, with his usual optimism, never considered that the nobles might not support him. He ignored the fact that the Pope might not grant him permission to marry his own niece. He believed what he wanted to believe. And in May 1475, according to plan, he crossed the border for the great adventure. At the town of Plasencia, he met Juana, the pawn in this game of politics, and on a high platform in the center of the town the so-called wedding took place, followed by a blare of trumpets and the loud voice of the herald proclaiming, "Castile for Don Alfonso of Portugal, and Queen Doña Juana, his wife, and the rightful owner of this kingdom." Isabella was at Valladolid with Ferdinand and their small daughter, the 5-year-old Infanta Isabel, when Alfonso crossed the border. Quite naturally, she had been distressed over the Archbishop of Toledo's desertion, which she knew was caused by his jealousy of the cardinal, her new prime minister. Although she had seen him storm off in a rage, Isabella could not forget the days when he had been like a father to her, had protected her from her brother, and made it possible for her to marry Ferdinand. She felt she must go to him, even though friends told her it was useless and also foolish. "I must do it," she replied, "or I should forever blame myself for not having tried to make him change his course." Leaving Ferdinand to gather forces along the border, Isabella set out on horseback for the Archbishop's palace, sending a count ahead to announce her arrival. "Isabella," snorted the Archbishop, "let her come in by one gate of this palace, and I will leave by the other." Disappointed, Isabella continued on to Toledo to recruit more forces, to meet Ferdinand there, and to consider how, without any money, they could fight this war that was being forced upon them. The treasury was empty. Enrique IV had stripped it. There was no money to buy arms, ammunition, or even food for the soldiers. A meeting of the Cortes was called, and the problem presented to them. Isabella's steadfast courage in the face of danger was always to inspire trust in her. Bishops of the church came forward and offered half of their silver plate, the amount of its value to be paid back in 3 years. Many nobles, moved by her unwavering courage, now deserted the rebellious Archbishop of Toledo and again declared their allegiance to Isabella. This was a great shock for Alfonso. This was not what the Archbishop had led him to expect. Where were all those nobles who were so sure to rally around him? Alfonso was then at the Spanish fortress of Toledo, which had been turned over to him by a disloyal governor when he had first crossed the border. And it was on a wide plain about 5 miles away in February 1476 that the deciding battle was fought in this foolish war on which he had so blithely embarked. The fighting was hand to hand and so fierce that after some hours the Portuguese troops weakened and gave way and were utterly defeated. Still, Alfonso was not ready to give up and make peace. Leaving his son John in Lisbon in charge of the government, he rushed away to France to have a long talk with King Louis, who was supposed to be his ally, but who had been of no real help. He found the old spider at Tours, his favorite residence. Louis embraced Alfonso like a long-lost brother, but cut short any talk of war with the curt remark that he had done his part. Alfonso hung around, trying in vain to get another word with the cagey old king, and also waiting and hoping for permission from the Pope to marry Juana. Finally, he became so disgusted that he decided to give it all up, the war, his bride, everything, even the crown of Portugal, and go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On impulse, he sent word to Lisbon, with the result that when he got home, he was astonished to find that he had been taken at his word. His son John had been proclaimed king. Prince John, who was known as the perfect prince, readily handed back the crown to his father. Alfonso then called off his marriage with Juana and signed a peace treaty with Isabella, whose right to be queen was never again challenged. Ferdinand and Isabella now had a year-old son, Juan, the joy and pride of his royal parents. Juana was given a choice of marrying him eventually or becoming a nun. As she was then already 16, she chose to become a nun in the Order of Santa Clara. To seal the treaty, another wedding was arranged. The Infanta Isabel, who was 9, was engaged to marry Prince John's son Alfonso when he should turn 14. It was September 24th, 1479, when the treaty was signed at Alcantara on the border of Portugal. From there, Isabella rode on horseback 200 miles to Toledo, where in November her third child was born. Her poor, unfortunate little daughter, Juana, who was to have such a tragic life. That same year, in Lisbon, Portugal, a marriage was recorded in the parish register between a foreign mapmaker from Genoa, Cristoforo Colombo, and a Portuguese lady of the aristocracy, Dona Filipa Perestrelo y Moniz. Dona Isabel, Felipe's mother, laid a faded old map of the Madeira Islands on the table in front of her new son-in-law, Christopher Columbus. Folding her small hands in her black silk lap, she sat back and beamed upon him with satisfaction. She was delighted by the interest Christopher took in her late husband's charts and writings, as well as in all the tales she had to tell of her early life on the Madeiras. Her husband, Don Bartholomew Perestrelo, she said, had gone out on the second colonizing expedition, appointed by Prince Henry as the hereditary captain of the island of Porto Santo. Columbus had never been to Porto Santo, but the year before he was married he had gone on business to Madeira and had seen its marvelous vineyards and its fields of sugar cane. He had been sent to buy sugar for a merchant in Genoa. After that brief business venture, Christopher had gone back into the shop with Bartholomew, making or selling maps and charts and poring by the hour over books on geography and travel. The book of Sir Marco Polo was his favorite, the marvels of the Far East told by the famous Venetian traveler who had made his journey 200 years ago. Starting out in 1271 as a boy of 17 with his uncle and his father, Marco Polo had traveled across the vast width of Asia to China, the empire of the Great Khan. The most interesting thing to Columbus was that Marco Polo gave to Asia much greater width than Ptolemy did. Ptolemy was a Greek astronomer and mathematician who had lived in Egypt around the year 150 A.D. Ever since his geography had been rediscovered, it was accepted as the absolute truth. Marco Polo, Columbus knew, was no scholar, but he had actually traveled around Asia and should know how far he went. If Asia was that much wider, then the Western Ocean must be just that much narrower. And if so, China could not be more than 5,000 miles from Portugal. Therefore, by sailing west from Portugal, one could reach the empire of the Great Khan. The chapel in which the Columbus brothers attended Mass adjoined the Convento dos Santos, a boarding school for the daughters of noble Portuguese families. One day, coming out of chapel or through the bars of the convent window, somehow or other, Christopher met Doña Felipa. He must have made a favorable first impression on her mother, Doña Isabel. He was a foreigner, to be sure, not the son of one of the first families of Portugal, whom Doña Isabel would have chosen for her daughter. But, after all, Felipa was 25, well beyond the age when she, poor child, would have been married had her mother been able to provide a suitable dowry for a young nobleman. Here was a young man, intelligent, well-mannered, who would no doubt succeed in the merchant marine business. And so they were married in the chapel. Doña Felipa Moniz and Cristoforo Colombo. After living for some time with Doña Isabel in Lisbon, the young couple went to make their home on the island of Porto Santo, where Doña Felipa's brother was Captain General. There, in 1480, a son was born and given the name of his father's younger brother, Diego. Did Felipa realize that Columbus would never be satisfied with quiet life on the islands? Her brother had shown him a piece of driftwood blown in from the west, carved like another picked up near the Azores. Could she see then how strong her husband's desire was to find the lands from which it came? A desire so strong that nothing could ever turn him aside until he had accomplished his purpose.